5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey space friends, we will talk about space tourism this week. Laura Forczyk is back. She just published a book called Becoming Off-Worldly that talks all about space tourism and the space tourism experience. Check out the link to the book in the episode notes. As an investor in space tourism and hopefully someday as a customer, I'm really excited about this one. Enjoy. Just as a reminder, if you enjoy the show, please leave us a review or rating on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple, so more people can find the podcast. Now, here are a couple of short messages from the sponsors, then enjoy my conversation with Laura Forczyk.
My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by NanoAvionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with their CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu.
Well, hello everybody. It's very exciting today. It's actually the first time we have a repeat guest on the show, Laura Forczyk. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks again for having me on.
I know, it's a pleasure. And tell us why you came back.
I want to introduce your audience to my brand new book that was just published this week, Becoming Off-Worldly, Learning from Astronauts to Prepare for Your Spaceflight Journey. And I know that your audience has an interest in business, so I would love to speak to you about the business of commercial human spaceflight.
Oh, we'll definitely do that, Laura. But let me tell you, just from the experience of some of the people that I interact with in space business, including our investors, this is actually a very emotional topic that people, are interested in as investors, but there's quite a few people who are also interested as potential customers. So I think we're going to discuss that from both perspectives.
Oh, this book is perfect for them because it is for people like me who do not have the financial means, but still the desire to go to space. And then people like maybe some of your listeners who actually have deposits down on one of the providers and might be thinking about how to prepare.
Yes, exactly. And we shall also tackle the question of, what one could do if one maybe thinks that the prices are a little bit intimidating, because maybe there's some options for those people too, for the rest of us, so to say. Yeah. The ones of us who are not, I wasn't going to say that 1%. It's at the moment it's the 0.001% or something like that. But we'll talk about the prices.
One thing I wanted to get across to your readers, I might as well mention it now, is it's not all billionaires. There really is plenty of room for it to open up to the more general population. And we have seen that in the past year.
Yes. That is a good message that we will definitely delve in on. Okay, but let's start off here. What made you want to write a book on space tourism? You're obviously quite knowledgeable. I know you're quite knowledgeable on many topics in space. Why did you pick space tourism?
Oh, so I have always wanted to go to space. I'm sure many of your listeners can relate to that ever since I was a kid, right? But I never really wanted to go the government route. First off, I'm actually too short according to NASA's current standards. ESA actually has a lower height requirement,
really?
But NASA, I'm not allowed to apply because I'm too short.
What are the requirements? Sorry, just to open the bracket here. What is the height requirement?
So for right now, and I apologize, I'm American, so I don't know what it is in centimeters, but for right now, 5'2" is the minimum height. And that's for the current solicitation. It changes every time, I do believe. So I meet the education requirements. I meet all these other requirements, but NASA is looking for any reason to cut out, potential candidates because they get thousands, tens of thousands. I think it was 18,000 applicants in the last solicitation, and they only have room to accept a handful. And so they are really looking to cut it down, looking for the best of the best. Also, if you look at government astronaut biographies, it really, truly is impressive. You talked about intimidating prices. I get intimidated by the biographies of the astronauts that are selected. They're just really impressive. And so for a variety of reasons, though, I never really felt that strong call for a NASA I'm American, so I would go through NASA to try to get that chance to go to space. And for most other countries out there, they just don't even have that opportunity. There's Canada, there's ESA, there's China and Russia, and there's just India. There's only a few countries around the world that you can even apply to be a government astronaut. And for most of the rest of the world, for over 3/4 of the world, there actually is no government path. You have to look ahead to commercial opportunities. So that's where I really got interested in commercial space, not through, a lot of the other ways that other people do, through satellites or Earth observation. For me, it was, how do I get myself up there? Whether it's suborbital or orbital or to the moon. The moon has always been my love because I am a planetary scientist with a background in lunar science. So for me, it was like, okay, how do I get myself to the moon? But I'll take anywhere. I'm not picky. So I really wanted to write this book for people like me, who are the vast majority of people on this planet who either, don't have the ability to get to space or have been applying and rejected through the government programs. And so it's really a look ahead at, it's no longer such of a narrow gate. It's a look ahead to the gate is opening. It's the new era of commercial human spaceflight. And yes, there's still a lot of gate opening to do. There's still a lot of people we still need to include. There's this term that's thrown around, democratization of space. I don't use that term a lot because I think we have a long way to go to get there, but that is the goal, is to open up human spaceflight for whoever it is who wants to go.
Yes. And like you're saying, that's a very long shot from sort of the ultra-selective government processes. We just recently added an astronaut, actually from South Korea, called So-Yeon Yi, the only Korean astronaut, to our advisory board. And she told me she was chosen out of 36,000 applicants.
She is an impressive individual. She's one of the interviewees in my book. So I interviewed 17 flown astronauts, plus 4 individuals who flew after I interviewed them, plus a handful of others who are still waiting for their flights. And she was one of the people who I interviewed for the book. I wanted to get a culturally diverse representation of the perspectives in the book.
Okay, yeah, we shall talk about that one too. I just want to sort of ask a follow-up question. One of the things you said, okay, you partly wrote the book because you're interested in sort of the commercial aspect, and you didn't want to go down the government route. But correct me if I'm wrong, isn't there also sort of like let's call it an in-between route, which is sort of government flights, but basically people who fly almost for companies, right? Sort of like government contractors. Right.
Yeah, ever since the early 1980s, with Charlie Walker flying through McDonnell Douglas Corporation as a NASA astronaut, we've been flying people sponsored by companies, sponsored by other individuals. And so this really isn't necessarily a new concept. It's just really opening up to a much wider pool of people. And so even in the book, I have a chapter on science and space. And at least one of the people I interviewed for that chapter, Alan Stern, he's going to be flying through his employer, but he's also selected by NASA to fly as well. So he's not a NASA astronaut per se, but he's still sponsored by both his employer and government. And so that's the kind of partnership that we could see moving forward, either not just individuals paying their own ways, but individuals being selected by government despite not being fully trained as government astronauts, or individuals selected by their employer, or individuals selected by a different corporation, whether that's Discovery Channel flying for a reality TV show or something else.
Well, exactly. I was thinking about that. So if we really believe that, and I think both you and I believe this to some extent, that at some point in time the commercial space industry is really going to take off, including in places like the moon, right? I mean, isn't it conceivable that besides the government astronauts and the tourists, you will have some mining company wants to check out something on the moon, they can't do it robotically, and then you fly up there with the mining company or something like that?
Absolutely. So one of the interviewees in the book is Michael Lopez Alegria. You might know him as LA. And he is a multiple flyer through NASA, but he's about to fly again through Axiom Space as an Axiom Space employee, taking up 3 other private individuals. And so you might see that not just as someone should guide the way of private individuals, but someone to do some kind of work, whether that is science or whether that's mining or some other types of of repair or maintenance or crew work.
So that's actually a good example to delve in a little bit on, so we can illustrate to the listeners who may not know what some of these private missions look like. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that Axiom 1 mission?
Sure. So Axiom was a private company that got a contract to build a segment onto the International Space Station that will then disconnect from the ISS at the end of ISS lifetime and become a free-flying commercial space station. And along with that initiative, they are also trying to build up a repertoire of private space missions. Private astronaut missions is what NASA calls them. And so they were selected for the first 2 private astronaut missions that NASA is going to allow to the ISS, which is separate from what Russia does. Russia has been allowing private astronauts for almost 20 years now. Oh, I guess it has been over 20 years. And so NASA is sort of late on the ball here. But that first Axiom mission, which is currently scheduled for late March. Hopefully that'll stay on track.
It got delayed, right? It was supposed to be end of February, I think.
It was supposed to be late last year, and then everything gets and so I'm crossing my fingers that they'll go in March. It's 3 private individuals who have never flown, have no prior spaceflight experience, plus a widely flown veteran astronaut, Mike L.A. And they are going to go up there for I forget, it's something like a week, 8 days, something like that. And they, just like previous private astronauts who have flown to the ISS, they are going to do a variety of things depending on their interest and backgrounds. So some of them might want to do outreach or art, and I know they've published that they're going to do science. But it's individuals who pay their own way to Axiom to go up there. And we've seen this. 2 of my interviewees in the book flew with Space Adventures in the 2000s. And so we've seen this happening now for quite some time. And I think it's going to become more common as commercial space stations come on board. Axiom just announced yesterday that they're going to have a special module specifically for filming movies. And so I think that we're going to see even more of that kind of diversification of the market, where you have individuals going up for science, you have individuals going up for art or movie filming or whatever it happens to be, that they have a desire to go to space. And it might not be the ISS, it might be future commercial space stations or to the moon.
Yes, and we'll talk about the moon. That's a very exciting topic. But let's stay in orbit for a while. Some of these missions and the orbital missions, and people, you talked about the orbital missions, like what are some of their expectations that they have if they haven't flown yet? And then maybe for the ones that have flown, how do the expectations compare to the experience? Yeah,
it really depends on the type of spaceflight that they're going to do. And I go into this a little in the book, where if you're going on a suborbital flight with Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin, it's a very quick training period. And so people who are selected, they might only have a few weeks or a couple of months to actually prepare themselves to think, what are they going to do when they get up there? And they only have a few minutes to actually perform what it is they're going to do, whether that is a quick science experiment or just hanging out at the window and staring out, at the beauty of Earth, or whatever it happens to be. But if you're going up to orbit, if you're going to the ISS or free flying around with Dragon, you're going to be training for a while. Inspiration 4 trained for about 6 months. The Space Adventures private astronauts tend to train for about 2 years. So there's a wide range there, but they're getting a lot of training. And I go through an interview in the book with one of the representatives from Space Adventures who goes through this extensive checklist of everything that you might want to think of if you're going to go up in space for orbit. All the equipment you might want to do, all the skills you might want to learn, such as photography, or all the kinds of equipment that you might want to use that belongs to another country, and you need to get permission to use that equipment. And so it's a long checklist, just depending on what your motivations are for going up there. And the spaceflight providers and facilitators are going to help you to determine what it is you need and what you need to think about and what you need to prepare. And one thing in the book I wanted to really put into readers' heads is it's not just physical preparation. Yes, you need to get fit, pass certain medical requirements, depending, we just had a 90-year-old William Shatner fly to space with Blue Origin. So it really just depends. But aside from those physical training that you might have heard of, the analogs of, flying on jets or going on a parabolic microgravity flight. Aside from those, there's also the mental and emotional and spiritual preparation that you might want to consider. It's risky, right? You're going to put your life on the line. So you need to consider your own mortality and how that affects your family and friends. Or there's this price shock, the sticker shock of, am I spending all of this money in a good way? And how do I get the most out of the money I'm spending? Or Or how do I get the most out of my sponsor's money? How do I get that science done to make sure that it's worth it? If I go up there for a few minutes, I need to get this science accomplished. How do I do that? It's a lot of mental and emotional preparation as well as physical.
The people that you talk to who have already flown orbitally, like what did they say about their mental experience? I mean, was it what they expected? Did they prepare in any way? Was there something that surprised them?
Yeah, the first half of the book is covering surprises that space flyers, whether it's government flyers or commercial flyers. And again, I interviewed 2 people who flew space adventures. Their mental preparations, and not only that, but their surprises. So for some people, you really cannot even prepare for the view of the Earth or the way that it makes you feel to see the Earth as one interconnected body. Getting used to the 3 dimensions as you use them in space, where there is no up and down, in a different way that we use 3 dimensions here on Earth. So there's so many different ways that flown astronauts experienced space that they just didn't expect. And that was something I really wanted to cover in the book, is what were those surprises, and how might a future flyer prepare for those surprises?
Yeah, and on the dimensions and the up and down. So I know that's not mental, it's physical, but let me ask anyway. So I was surprised. I was speaking to one of the big spaceflight providers, and they actually told me that a significant number of astronauts, including government ones, actually experience space sickness, which I didn't know. Is that something that people are generally prepared for and expect, you think?
It is completely unknown who's going to experience it and who doesn't. And about half, if not more, do experience it for at least a day, sometimes as long as a few days. And one of the best ways to sort of get over that is to use medication. But I even mentioned in the book that not everyone does. Some people just forgo the medication. And so different perspectives on how you might prepare. And really, it's just allowing yourself that time. If you're going up for more than a few days, you need to just allow yourself that extra time to get used to it. And so you mentioned that microgravity is physical, not mental, but it's actually both. So you have the space adaptation sickness, but you also have the perspective change and the ways that you move. And a few of the interviewees talked about how they didn't even realize how well they were adjusting to microgravity until a new crew came on board, and they watched the new crew fumble around, and it's almost like humanity adapts to the new environment without even realizing it. We're just so very adaptable. And some of that is physical, but some of that is also mental.
Yeah. And then, by the way, in terms of I guess it's sort of related to preparation, but it's actually the criteria, right? And, for example, the height criteria we're talking about for the private people, the people who pay. And in the case of Axiom, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's $55 million. So it's quite a lot of money. Do they get any break on the criteria, or is it exactly the same criteria as for the government guys?
Oh, no. So the private commercial spaceflight providers will determine their own criteria, their own physical criteria. One of the people I interviewed in the book, who is a future Axiom customer, he is elderly. And so just like how they're going to have to put him through physicals, and he has been going through physicals, and they're going to make sure that he passes a minimum, physical and mental requirement, but Axiom sets that, just as other spaceflight providers, whether that's SpaceX or whether that's Roscosmos with the space adventures, or whether that's, the suborbital, Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic, they're going to set their own criteria. And some of it might just be very basic. I know when I was undergoing ground-based training for suborbital research flights, it was just a basic physical. That's all. I just had to prove that I was healthy enough. And it might have changed since then, but I believe they're really trying to open it up. So, for example, Haley Arsenault, who flew with SpaceX through Inspiration 4, she was the first person to publicly fly with a prosthetic. So NASA astronauts have flown with prostheses, but it hasn't really been public before. And she was able to withstand high levels of Gs on her prostheses, which is pretty amazing to figure out. And it's just we haven't allowed that in the past because government spaceflight has been so exclusive. But the point of commercial spaceflight is to open it up to other people, to allow for differences in bodies and differences in disabilities. And that's something I really touch upon in the last chapter of the book, is making sure we really truly look to see who we're opening it up to, geographically, socioeconomically, and physically, with all the different hidden and visible disabilities that are out there. We really want to make sure that we can be as inclusive as possible as we move forward.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating, isn't it? And I'm sure you noticed, but the latest ESA astronaut, so the European astronaut selection, right, and which doesn't happen nearly as often as the US one, unfortunately, but they specifically want to integrate some handicapped people in the astronaut corps. I'm sure you saw that.
Yeah, I included that in the last chapter, the specifics that they are looking for, and it's still very limited, but they are looking for someone either short in stature or has a limb deficiency, which I think is fantastic that they're taking that opportunity to really open that up. There's another group I mentioned in the final chapter that is flying people with disabilities who, fly on a zero-G flight, a parabolic flight.
Yeah.
That, they are not just flying for the fun of it. They're flying so that they can prove that they can and to offer suggestions on how to make minor accommodations for future space flights. And I think that's really useful because as we move forward and we want to increase the representation of who goes to space, it's not just going to be the elite of the elite, the best of the best. It's going to be all of humanity, right? We want to give everyone the opportunity who wants to be able to fly, just like how pretty much anyone who wants to can fly in an airplane today. There are two futures that I outline in the book. One future is that spaceflight becomes as common as air flight. Another future is that spaceflight remains very risky and elusive and limited, like flying or climbing Mount Everest, for example. And so I think spaceflight will probably be somewhere in between, but I'd like it to be more like just hopping on a plane.
Yeah, and just finishing up on the sort of the handicap point, I do think it's fascinating, right? Because if you imagine somebody who is, let's say, paraplegic, so they don't have the use of their legs, if you're on the ISS, that's completely fine, right? Because you just basically use your arms.
Yeah, there are so many ways that we can really accommodate people who have disabilities. I mean, I've got 2 children who have disabilities. And so I realize now how much ableism is in our society that is really easy to correct if we just go and put those accommodations out there and realize that in some ways, spaceflight can be a lot easier on certain people with certain disabilities than others.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about sort of orbital space flights and the Axiom 1 mission. We did briefly mention already the suborbital flights. Do you just want to give us the summary on the suborbital flights?
Sure. So right now there are 2 spaceflight providers that are leading suborbital human spaceflight. So Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin both flew high-profile flights last year. Blue Origin was the first and has been the first so far to fly 3 private flights that are flying paying customers. Virgin Galactic has not yet actually flown paying customers, but Virgin Galactic's flight in July does have the notable distinction of having the first human-tended suborbital science experiment ever done, which I just think is very exciting because I am a scientist. And so you can see how both companies are taking different approaches, but also offering the same kinds of experiences, very different vehicles, but both offer that beautiful view of Earth, both offer a few minutes of microgravity, both offer a ride of a lifetime. It's very interesting to see, and it will be more interesting to see how these 2 companies market themselves and what markets they go after, whether it is the high profile tourists like, William Shatner or a famous football player or Wally Funk. Wally Funk was one of the ones I interviewed in my book before and after her space flight, because she did not know when I first interviewed her that she would be chosen for that first Blue Origin flight. Wow. And so these very high profile individuals on Blue Origin, along with paying customers, regular everyday people, like the first 18-year-old to fly to space, for example. He was the very first paying customer to fly on a suborbital flight. Technically his father paid, but and then you've got Virgin Galactic, which is also going after, high wealth individuals, but they have yet to actually fly those first ones. So the Italian Air Force is looking to fly this year with Virgin Galactic, and it'll be really interesting to see how these 2 companies continue on, both in terms of their operability, like how they operate into their cadence and where they operate, as well as who gets to fly on them.
Yeah, and those suborbital flights, I think, are basically, Virgin Galactic is $450,000, if I remember correctly, which they actually increased the price last year from $250,000.
They did.
Blue Origin, I think, is still not disclosed, but I think it's around the same level.
It's probably just a little bit higher, based on the fact that they started out with that auction, and that auction winner, who has not yet flown, and that's for charity too, so take this with a grain of salt, but he paid $28 million plus fees for that flight. And then they're going to the auction runner-ups. So one of the people I interviewed in the book, Dylan Taylor, he recently flew in December. He was one of the runner-ups in the auction. And again, not disclosed about how much he paid, but it's probably a little higher than Virgin Galactic at this point.
Oh, sure, for sort of the first flights and the sort of auctions for charity. Yeah, I meant sort of on a steady state, but I guess it is a significant difference, right, to the orbital flights. So again, if you take the Axiom price, which is still officially at $55 million, it's basically it's a 99% discount if you go suborbitally. Although I guess if you look at it on a sort of per minute basis, it'll look quite differently.
Yes, per minute basis, orbital is cheaper, but it is more than an order of magnitude more expensive to go to orbit. You're looking at, $500,000 approximately for Virgin Galactic or probably Blue Origin versus, $50-ish million for orbital. I think it might be a little less if you go through Space Adventures than if you go through Axiom. Another one is just going through SpaceX directly. So it was approximately $200 million for that 4 seats of the Inspiration 4 mission to go for 3 days around orbit in a SpaceX Dragon. And then we do not know how much was paid for that cislunar trip on a future Starship. That still remains a mystery. And that also changes in terms of how many people are going to be on board. Yes. So he booked the entire flight and not necessarily by seat. So we're just going to have to see how these prices play out. The ideal is that it will become less expensive over time as the flights become more profitable and more regular. But right now we're in the infancy of the industry. So prices are actually increasing and there is no incentive for these companies to drop prices because the pent-up demand is there.
Well, that's exactly right, Laura. I mean, sort of speaking, wearing my investor hat for a moment. So that's why we invested in space tourism as well. Although you will point out that it's technically not space via space perspective, and we can talk about balloons in a second, but it's like you said, in the foreseeable future, there's just going to be a supply-demand mismatch, right? Because there's just very few ways to get near space or into space. And there's actually quite a few wealthy people in the world.
You're absolutely right. And of course, I wanted to, again, point out that it's not just wealthy people who are flying to space. They are also sponsoring other individuals. So that is something that I think has been misrepresented in the news, especially last year with that billionaires in space kind of narrative that we saw. It's going to be a lot more regular individuals who at this point are fortunate. They have connections. They're either being sponsored by a billionaire or sponsored by a company, but it's going to be opening up. And I'm looking forward to seeing how those seats get opened up even more to people like you and me. So right now, you really do have to have the right connections or the really good fortune of winning a contest or whatever it have to be if you do not have the financial means to fly yourself. But, this industry is so new. I really do think that it's going to change quite a bit over the next decade or two.
I mean, let me ask you maybe this question. If we could pick people, let's say we had a pool of money like you Laura and Raphael, and we could sponsor people, like who should go? Well,
that's an excellent question. And there are organizations that are doing that, right? So Space for Humanity, for example, is one that is trying to do just that. And they pick someone who, again, is from a country that's never seen anyone fly in space. There's just so many people who have been left out of the opportunities to even fly, not even accounting for their backgrounds, their educational backgrounds, or their financial means. And so it really is very limited right now. And so we feel like we have that scarcity mindset. Who should be allowed to fly? I think everybody should be allowed to fly. And I want to get past that scarcity mindset. We're not anywhere close to that yet, but that's where I want to see the industry going, is that it's no longer, who's limited, who's going to take that limited seat. It's, okay, who wants to? And whoever wants to should get that opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's right. What I mean is, I think that there's one argument that in the meantime, while we can't send everybody, that how can I say this? We send the right, I mean, these days we have many sort of people we call influencers, right? I guess there have always been influencers, right? Just the media change. But I guess we want to maybe send the right sort of influencers, right? Who can kind of spread the right message, if that makes sense.
I think that the people who have flown so far have been really good at that. The people who want to be out there and influence. And I do go in the book with the interviews of why people want to fly. And for some of them, it really is, I don't know if you want to call it influencers, but it's outreach. It's inspiration of other people who are coming from different geological background, different geological regions that do not have those kinds of inspirational figures. Or maybe it's a woman where women in that particular culture have been oppressed historically, and they want to show that a woman can fly in space. There's just so many different examples, but there's also, different reasons, like art. I interviewed 2 people who are artists who talked about how they wanted, they want that opportunity to see Earth in a way that will help them with their art, or even just the art of designing spacesuits and space habitats. So there's really endless reasons why someone might want to fly. And I don't think it's up to you or me or the spaceflight providers to say which ones get priority. There's a book that I reference in the introductory chapter by a colleague of mine, See You in Orbit, by Alan Ludwig. And he goes into the history of how NASA got to the point of choosing a teacher in space. And, there were debates about, do you choose an educator? Do you choose a journalist? Do you choose an influencer? Do you choose politicians? Who gets to fly? And again, it's all the scarcity mindset. I think that there are endless reasons why anybody should be able to fly in space. And who's to say what reason is better than another?
Okay, let me just be devil's advocate here. While we can't have everybody fly, we have to make sure that we maintain public support for space, right? So, NASA has enough budgets and all of that in other countries. And so we really need to kind of spread the space message that space is a good thing. I guess that's why we need the influencers, right? While we cannot fly everybody yet.
I think that's a great reason why you should fly, because you've got, your circle of connections, you've got your podcast, you've got your course, right? You can be someone who is an influencer, but that's not the only reason, right? We don't know who the vast, millions of people are who fly in airspace. So it'll get to that point where there will be anonymous people flying in space, and it's not up to the public to decide who that is.
Yeah, no, fully agreed. By the way, we were talking about suborbital versus orbital. Correct me if I'm wrong. I can't think of anybody who has done both, right?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Not on purpose. So there was that.
Okay.
Okay, so they're having people.
Oh no! Wait! Oh, I'm stupid. I'm just not going back and not find out.
Yeah. Historically, there have been John Glenn. He flew, and then there was that aborted Russian mission where technically he flew suborbitally. But off the top of my head, there's been no commercial, customer
private
that has flown both suborbital and orbital.
Yes.
But to get back to your point, actually, about inspiring, there are people that I spoke to who either have flown or will fly that do talk about wanting to go up there for the right reasons, to make sure that they're doing it right in the beginning, making sure that they as pioneers are opening up that gate that I talked about. And so you have people like Jared Eisman. Jared was the sponsor of Inspiration 4, and he talked about how he really, really, really wanted to get this mission right so he could inspire other people and open up the paths for other people to follow. And then you've got Dylan Taylor, who has that buy one, give one philosophy that he just initiated with his flight in December, where he took the money that he spent on a Blue Origin ticket, and he is also giving that equivalent money to charities or organizations that he thinks is worthy to sponsor. So I think it's really important in the beginning, as we're trying to get that good message publicly, to show that yes, we do have really good reasons. And William Shatner is not someone that I interviewed in the book, but I included his words because they were just so poetic when he landed. The ways that he was inspired by the environmentalism, mentality of the Earth atmosphere is so fragile and we need to protect it, which is a very common overview effect kind of mentality that people come home with. So there are so many different ways that we can send all kinds of people up and have that kind of positive message on the way back.
For those listeners who don't know, do you want to just give us the summary of the overview effect? And I saw Frank White even wrote the foreword to your book, I think.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for Frank White for writing the foreword to the book. He's the author of several books, including The Overview Effect. He coined the term. It's a cognitive shift in how people perceive the planet or their lives after their space flights. And for him, for Frank White, he actually was inspired during a plane ride, a air flight. So you don't even necessarily need to be in space. And not everyone is going to have this overview effect, and not everyone is going to experience it in the same way. But each person has the opportunity to be able to have this change of thought or have this new perspective by seeing Earth from above as an interconnected planet. For some people, it's the environmentalism movement, where they recognize that Earth is completely our reason for existing, right? We've got the blackness of space and we've got our planet, and that is home and that is life. For other people, it's the way that we humans are affecting it. So Richard Garriott, who I interviewed in the book, talked about how he saw humans touching Earth everywhere, land, earth, and sea. Sky and sea. And so, it's all very interconnected of the way the air currents move, or the way the water currents move. And for some people, it's more like they want to go visit the places that they saw from space, where they saw it from a distance and now they want to go explore it, or the way that humanity is interconnected. Nushay Ansari is one of the people I interviewed in the book who grew up in war-torn Iran during the revolution. And she talked about how it was really touching for her to see just, this is home. We are one peoples. We are one Earth. Why are we fighting on Earth? What is the point of all the conflict on Earth? And each person's going to have a different perspective, and it might be very shocking. I think William Shatner was shocked at his perspective when he landed back after his Blue Origin flight. Some people might not have any kind of cognitive shift at all. And it's just going to be really dependent on each person. It does not seem to be dependent on time or altitude. And I'm looking forward to the sociology that comes out of studying commercial astronauts after they've flown, to see how this shift changes their lives, or if it changes their lives.
With regard to the overview effect, which is something I think most of these professional astronauts have reported, and as you said, some of the private space explorers too, did you see any sort of difference, for example, between the orbital and suborbital guys, or also like any cultural differences between people from different cultures?
I don't think we have enough data. So I'm going back to my science hat here, where I'm a physical scientist, not a social scientist, but I really don't think we have enough data yet to be able to really say if there's a difference orbital versus suborbital, or if there's a difference in cultures. It does not seem to be dependent on orbital or suborbital or on culture, but who knows, we might find something once we have higher numbers. And again, I'm really looking forward to those studies.
Okay, that's a very good point. That sort of having not enough data, I'm just going to use that as a segue for another question I wanted to ask. Another thing we actually arguably don't have enough data on is the safety track record of some of the vehicles currently being used. And you mentioned sort of safety and the fear of death 20 minutes ago. How often does the safety aspect come in? How often did it come up in your conversations? How much are people thinking about that?
Yeah, this is definitely a risky business, right? And so people need to be aware of the fact that they are putting their lives on the line. We often don't think about it when we're doing risky things like driving in a car, but when it comes to something unusual, like strapping yourself to a rocket, most people are thinking about it. Not everyone has the same perspective in terms of mortality and risk, but at least in the United States, you have to sign away waivers to say that you understand that you might die on these flights, and it's not going to be the fault necessarily of the spaceflight provider. It's just inherently risky. And so when it comes to commercial spaceflight, price and risk seem to be the top things that come to mind. And for a large segment of the population, price isn't even a concern. For those special people who are not me, it's really the risk and the experience of it. And for some people like Dylan Taylor, after he came back, he mentioned that he wasn't worried about the risk at all because he was just worried about it might cancel and that they might have to abort. He wasn't worried about the death aspect necessarily. He came to peace with that. Whereas William Shatner talked about how he was scared to death and he really did think that he might die on that flight. And so as the track records get built up, and of course we're going to have accidents, there are going to be fatalities. We know this just because of history. This is going to be something that we need to deal with. And we don't know yet how the market is going to react, how the government regulators are going to react, how the spaceflight providers are going to react. But just like how any other mode of transportation, any other risky adventure tourism that is out there, it's something to come to grips with, but not something to stop the industry.
Yeah, no, and you're of course right. If talking about, for example, adventure tourism, I mean, I've been down in Antarctica and up to the North Pole, and I remember being up the North Pole, and there was a Russian guard with me with an extremely high caliber rifle because, as he said, because of the bears. And another time I was at Everest Base Camp and talking to the climbers, and they were telling me that statistically the death rate above base camp when you go further towards the top of Everest it's above 3%, which is really quite significant if you think about it. And people do it every year, right? So I guess as long as people are conscious about it, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that it's a mentality decision, right? Each person's going to have their different perspective of what risk they're willing to take. And for some people, that's going to be, a willing risk. I would sign myself up. I wouldn't sign myself up today, to clarify. I
And
think
I assume
I'd
that's
want to
because
wait
you
a
have
little
smoke.
bit more.
Because you have
But
smoke
I would
experience,
sign
right?
myself up, and I'd come to terms with that with my family, with my husband. It's something that each person needs to decide for themselves. What's worth that risk? And I think that progressing humanity forward into the stars and me getting that personal experience to be able to do that is worth the risk.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about another couple of types of space tourism. Let's talk about the moon first. You mentioned you love the moon. We have, as you mentioned, one flight already booked. As you said, no officially disclosed price. I think we can triangulate from a few numbers that it's sort of in the mid hundreds of millions of dollars. Yusaku Maezawa from Japan on the Starship on a circumlunar Apollo 8 type mission. How feasible you think something like that is, and how do you see moon tourism evolving?
It is definitely feasible, but it is not feasible in 2023, as they had been saying. But we're going to see Starship come online, and if not Starship, then other vehicles in the future that are going to have this capability. And of course, Starship is already planning to do government missions to land on the moon. So I really do think it's feasible for there to be a commercial mission around the moon in the near future with SpaceX Starship. And the interesting thing that we're going to have to see is that mix between private customers, the people sponsored by the financier, along with the crew, because for that mission, there is envisioned to be crew. And for those who don't know, it's called Dear Moon or Dear Moon Project. Initially, he wanted to take up artists with him, and now he's opened it up to all creators and hasn't finally announced the finalists for that mission yet. I applied, and I assume I'm rejected since I have not gotten a call. So we're just going to have to wait to see who he brings along. But then it's also envisioned that there's going to be SpaceX crew that accompanies him, and who's that going to be? And so I think that it's really feasible to see these types of mixed missions go up, where it's private individuals with a crew, maybe even future mixed government missions, although that's nowhere near anywhere close. But we see this already with ISS, so I see no reason why we wouldn't see it with the moon in the future once we get those missions established. Once we have these moon bases that are envisioned, I really do think that it'll be a mix of government and commercial, just like we're seeing happening on the ISS.
And then looking a little bit further, I mean, so this is, as I said, a circumlunar mission where you fly around the moon, which is already very exciting, I think. I assume landing on the moon is quite a few years further out because of the additional complexities, right?
Complexities and money and priorities as well. So SpaceX has been contracted to do that Artemis 3 landing, which is currently scheduled for 2025, although I wouldn't bet money on that date. But, sometime in the next, several years, we're going to see, NASA astronauts return to the surface of the moon. And it's envisioned that NASA and partner astronauts will keep returning through Artemis 5 and beyond is the current plan. And so once we get that cadence established of government missions landing on the moon, and it might not be only SpaceX, there are other competitors such as Blue Origin that want to land human landers on the surface of the moon. And that's not even counting the Chinese, Russian missions that want to begin sometime in the 2030s. And so it's completely feasible to think that in the future, there might be a mix. But for right now, just because of priorities, it'll be focused on government. Government's the one that's giving the money right now. And so unless there's some other private individual who's going to pay for a lunar landing and they want to do that like now, I don't see that priority shifting, but it's definitely going to happen in the future.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I just feel like that what I meant by additional complexity is just things like life support systems and spacesuits, which you probably don't want to test on tourists first. You probably leave it to the professionals, I'm assuming.
That's a really good point. There are a lot of commercial companies out there building spacesuits. SpaceX has their white, cool-looking spacesuits. Each spaceflight company has their own take on life support and spacesuits, and all the ways that they can really make commercial customers feel like they belong, and or even do the science that they want to do, and whether or not that needs an EVA or not. For NASA missions to the International Space Station, there is no EVA allowed. There's no spacewalking on any of the Axiom missions because it's just not allowed through NASA. But Russia is allowing it. So Russia, if you go through Roscosmos, you could potentially do a commercial EVA, although it's never been done. But I'm looking forward to that day. So that's like the first step. And then we can think in the future how that might be extended to lunar missions or Martian missions or, wherever it is that we want to take people.
I forgot to ask you, so I mean, what if something happens, something goes wrong, and I don't mean like the rocket exploding and you're kind of dead right away. Let's say there's some like medical emergency. Do you know what would happen? I mean, even on the ISS, I guess if there was some real emergency, then basically, what would you do? You could take the Soyuz lifeboat, I suppose. But is your health insurance going to pay for that?
We just had a Russian film crew go up, a filmmaker and an actress go up for this sort of concept, right? What happens if you have a medical emergency in space? And so that Inspiration 4 mission did take up Haley Arsenault, who's a physician's assistant. So they did have a medical personnel on that mission, but it's not a requirement. And it will be interesting to see, what happens if there is a medical emergency, or is there going to be a standard for having someone who's medically trained go up on these missions? It's not an issue for a suborbital flight. They're too quick.
Yeah, sure. It's very true.
I think that orbital flights might just have a different perspective, or beyond, I should say, anywhere that we choose to go for longer than a day.
Yeah, no, exactly. But then if you're on the ISS, you're sort of, it depends on the exact orbital dynamics, but you're sort of quite a few hours actually from medical care, full-scale medical care. I guess on the moon, you're several days away from full-scale medical care, right?
And that's the whole concept of living and working in space on the ISS or in low Earth orbit, to figure out how that we do this. And we do have now decades of experience that we can translate. The Russians have been doing this for quite a long time, that the Americans are we have this experience, but I think the two countries combined have extensive experience learning how to live and work in space. It's just slightly different if you're farther away. So if you've got longer missions to the moon or even longer missions to Mars, we're just going to have to extend that experience and learn how to adapt in new environments.
Yeah, I think we have to figure this out somehow. It's funny. I was about 10 days ago, I was down at Spacecom in Orlando on a panel with Sam Simani from NASA, and we were talking about this. And I was telling Sam this famous story from the Russian and the Soviet Antarctica station in the 60s, where the only physician got appendicitis and he had to self-operate.
Oh my gosh. I'll have to read up on that story.
You didn't know that?
I did not know that.
Oh, look it up. It's fascinating. It's literally like Murphy's Law, right? The only trained guy gets appendicitis. So I'm assuming, I'm envisioning like the Soviet guy having some sips of vodka and taking out the scalpel, and you go from there. So I was throwing that at Sam, and it was like, Sam, what if something similar happens in space? And Sam was like, I'm not going to take anybody with an appendix, which I thought was cheating. I thought we have to figure this out. So one thing I like
to talk about in my business is that anybody can work in the space industry. So this is a good example of, we need doctors in the space industry. We need flight surgeons. We need people who are medically trained, not just engineers.
Yes. Okay. So we talked about the moon, we talked orbital, we talked suborbital. Let's briefly touch upon the balloons. The balloons who go, they say, to the edge of space. What do you think about the balloons?
I would love to go on one of those high altitude balloons. So there are several companies that are trying to go up with people on these gondolas, essentially, that will go up not to space, but high enough where you see the blackness of the sky and the curvature of the Earth. It's just about 30 to 40 kilometers up, whereas space is somewhere between 80 and 100 kilometers. And I go into that in the book if you want to learn about the debate of where space begins. But I would still love to go up. You're not weightless because you're not in free fall, but you do get to see that beautiful view of the Earth. And so we talked about the overview effect. Maybe those near space customers will get that overview effect just by being that high.
Yeah. And I'm partly talking my book here, right? Because we invested in one of these companies, Space Perspective, but I'm really excited that it's another way of making it more accessible, right? Because it's not a rocket. It's basically almost no perceptible G-forces. I could send my sort of 80-year-old parents on that, I think, and you're still getting a similar experience.
Yes. And so it's very calm, not only for science experiments, but again, for people. And so they talk about, having wedding parties or, whatever it may be that you want to fly up there. And I think that's a really great business. And I'm really excited to see that happen. It's been in the works for quite some time with companies like Worldview, for example, that spun off the Space Perspective, and other companies out there too, some in Spain, one in Japan. There's around the world, there's companies that are trying to envision the way that we can take people higher and higher and higher. And again, it could be for just, having a party, or it could be for science, or there's just endless reasons why you you might want to go up high above, in the stratosphere. And I'm really interested to see how that compares to, if someone wants to go on multiple of these flights, how high altitude balloon, and then suborbital and then orbital, and to see how that experience differs. And I sign myself up. I volunteer to be the kind of person who will tell you how that might differ if someone's listening and they want to sponsor me.
Yeah, I must admit I have put down a deposit.
There you go.
But only
you tell me how it is.
Deposit is refundable, and the balance that still needs to be paid is still quite intimidating. But I do really like the idea of it as well. Okay, so gosh, we've been talking for almost an hour here. We could go on for another few hours, I'm sure. Is there anything else sort of we didn't touch upon that's in the book that you think is worth mentioning?
So one of the things I want readers to really take away is that it's opening up to just about anyone, right? So there are a lot of the people that are listening right now who have been excluded because they have applied and have been rejected, or they don't live in a country where they can apply. And so I want them to keep hope that this is changing. In a way, it's changing slowly because we've been waiting for decades, but in another way, it's changing very, very quickly. Last year showed us just how quickly this whole suborbital industry, not to mention that inspiration formation that almost came out of nowhere, it changes so quickly. So just imagine how it's going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now, and don't discount the opportunity that you or someone you know is going to fly. And I love the fact that with each mission that's announced, I know somebody who's about to fly. And I'm like, yes, I love that. So as more and more people get to know other people who've flown, whether it's a colleague or a neighbor or a friend, or even just someone who's from their country or culture, and that's really unusual, it's going to become more real for people. And it's really going to touch more and more lives. And I'm really looking forward to the day when it's no longer billionaires in space narrative, but it's, hey, I'm going on this great adventure. Do you want to come with me? Or I'm going to go do this science experiment for work. Wish me luck. It's changing, and it's going to change so much in the coming decades.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think is the most likely scenario, what it's going to be like you said, 10, 15 years from now?
We're going to see a lot more people flying. So only a little over 600 people have flown in space ever. And so that number is going to double, triple, in the coming decades, probably just, in the coming decades, we're going to see so many more people, hundreds, if not thousands of people fly. It's not all going to be in one spaceflight provider either. It's going to be diversified. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the different people experience the different experiences of, flying on a space plane versus a traditional rocket, suborbital versus orbital versus a cislunar trip around the moon.
Yeah. Do you think there's any chance it might ever become like a mundane experience? And what I mean by that is, as you know, there are some companies, including SpaceX, which have, long-term plans, which for point-to-point suborbital hypersonic flights, right? You go from, I don't know, New York to London or something like that. Suborbitally, hypersonically, you would arguably be high enough that you would have that nice view of the Earth. I don't know whether these vehicles would have windows at every seat, probably not, but then maybe you would have cameras and then projected inside. I don't know. Do you think if something like that happened, that space travel might become mundane in any way?
Yeah. So in the book, I mentioned that there's those two paths, right? One is that it could become like airlines and you just want to get your flight over with. And so I still love looking out the window on a plane and seeing the view, but I really do just want to get that flight over with. So it really could become just like that.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Laura, any closing thoughts, closing words on space tourism, on the book?
Well, you can buy the book on Amazon, or if you go to astrolytical.com, you can get an autographed copy. Also, I'm creating a course along with the book. So if you want to go to astrolytical.com, you can pre-register for the course. It's called Prepare to Become Off-Worldly, and it's very interactive. So at the end of a lot of the chapters of the book, I give suggestions on how you might prepare. And the course is going to go into that even deeper of how you're going to prepare for your future spaceflight, whether you know the date of that future spaceflight or whether that's sometime in the future.
Well, it feels certainly like something that all of these spaceflight companies should throw in as required reading. Sort of like, hey, you paid $450,000, you paid $55 million, you get a free book for preparation.
Hey, I'll even sign it.
There you go. Laura, thank you so much. And, I hope you and I, a few years from now, we'll have a chance to go and we'll see how our experience was.
I look forward to flying with you, Raphael. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Laura.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.